As a small child, I remember standing during the singing of a hymn. It was a sanctuary quite a bit different than this. It had one center aisle, large vaulted ceiling with all dark wood. But I wasn't looking at the architecture. Heaven knows I spent long enough studying the ceiling as a child and looking at the room we worshiped in. That memory that I'm looking back on today, I was standing there next to my great-grandpa Galvin, who had his hands folded behind him as we sang. And I was frustrated because I must have been old enough to read, but not well. And I had the hymnal. And as we were singing, I couldn't keep up. And I thought, if we would just slow down, then I could sound out the words and keep up with the hymn. But obviously, they're not going to change the tempo for a little kid. But I looked up at my great-grandpa, and he just had his hands folded behind him. No hymnal. Just singing out in his gravelly voice, for all the saints who from their labors rest. No words needed. And I wanted to be able to do that. So I asked him after the service, how did you know all the words? Because it was like that every Sunday, every hymn, he knew the words. And he laughed and threw his head back. God love it. That was one of his go-to expressions. I didn't learn until many years later that what sounded to me like God love it was actually God love it. And I didn't realize that until long after that. God love it. I've been singing those hymns for so long, over 80 years. You'd think I ought to know them by now. My great-grandpa Galvin, always inspired me in my faith. And so today, as we celebrate All Saints' Day, we remember those who inspired us. From around the 4th century, All Saints was a time to look back and remember the martyrs. But over the years, it's sort of morphed into a time to give thanks for all of those Christians, all of those Christ followers, both living and dead, and remember them. And so as we think about this day, I want to invite you to think of someone specific. Someone in your life who had a big impact in your faith. It can be more than one if you want, but picture that person, because we join a legacy of spiritual formation that goes all the way back to Jesus. In our reading from Revelation, we find this great multitude gathered around the throne of God. And these verses of assurance describe the scene John the Revelator saw when the boundaries of God's kingdom extended well beyond the limits he imagined. This reading takes up a story already in progress. And so in addition to jumping into the middle of a story, we are also reading from Revelation. And many people struggle with making sense of all of the imagery and poetry in this kind of literature. So when we read from Revelation, I want you to keep two things in mind. One, the text was written for an oppressed people during a troubling time. This was for a specific audience who were being persecuted and experiencing a terrible reality. That's who this was for. And then the second thing is, don't let the way people have imagined this text shape your reading. So many people have taken the imagery and then tried to shoehorn it into some sort of prediction, some sort of way to enumerate the future. So-called end times literature will pick and choose different phrases and passages instead of allowing the text to speak these words of comfort about no more tears shall be cried, the sun shall not strike you by day. So keep those two things in mind. Now, our reading begins after this, so we should look back and say, what came before? This is a part of a much bigger scene depicting John's vision of the heavenly throne room. And the lamb, and we associate the lamb with Jesus, although Jesus isn't named in this section. The lamb is opening these 7 seals of this mysterious scroll. Now, again, keep in mind that the seals, the scroll, the lamb, these are all meant to provide comfort for this troubled people. So this isn't about some specific seal or scrolls. This is about trying to provide comfort and give meaning to people's reality. And our reading is an interruption of this opening the scrolls. Earlier in Revelation 7, 4-8, we see this description of the 144,000. Okay, we get an exact number here. And that's dangerous for us because we take exact numbers and treat them as an exact number. In biblical literature, throughout biblical literature, almost any time you see a number, and the 144 is 12,000 from each of the 12 tribes, it means a lot. That's what it means. It's a lot. And so these numbers are symbolic. And so this interruption, our reading of this interruption of opening scrolls describes this great multitude that now goes beyond this a lot, 144,000, to every tribe, every nation, people of all languages, and it just blows the walls off the boundaries. So you go from there were a lot to a great multitude. And to make that point clear, every nation, every tribe, every language. It's like it was saying, look, God cares about the people of ancient Israel. That's what came before. But oh yeah, everyone else too. And that's where this reading comes in with these words of comfort. Everyone is singing and praising God, and they don't even need to look at the hymnal. They knew the words. And this multitude reminds us that those who went before us, their lives, their witness, everything taught us to become a sign for others. And this sign is what shows us how to live and shows others how to follow Jesus. And during the singing, one of the elders turns to John the Revelator and say, "Who are they?" All the multitude who's now showing up around the heavenly host and the angels. Who are they? And John's like, I don't know. And then it's like this elder goes, oh, they're the ones. I know who they are. They're the ones who survived all of the ordeal and all of the persecution. They're the ones who made it through. They washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. Now, for our ears, blood of the Lamb is an unfortunate expression. And so I'm going to ask you to set aside this grotesque imagery because it's not how we talk anymore. And it doesn't really make a ton of sense in the vernacular of the 21st century. We would probably rephrase blood of the Lamb as the sacrificial love of one who loves us more than we could ever ask or imagine. Sure, that's a little wordy. I'll grant you that. But I think it drives the point home. As in, these are the ones who survived the great ordeal, and they've washed their robes and made them whole in the sacrificial love of the one who loves us more than we could ever ask or imagine. Growing in faith is a product of active participation. The saints who went before us washed their robes. No one washed them for them. Notice the participation in the passage. They washed their robes. They acted. The faithful witness of Jesus can be anyone's work. It's not exclusive to the apostles, to the forefathers and mothers, to the priests, to the pastors, to the Sunday school teachers. The apostles lived lives of active faith. Their disciples lived out an active faith. And the great multitude who gathered around the throne room of heaven lived out an active faith and lived out this message of hope. For the original hearers of this passage, talk of being washed and restored, especially when it talks about salvation, would have been political. Because at that time, and to John's hearers, salvation only came from Rome. That's the way you talk of salvation. And so when he introduces this idea of salvation from something else, this is an act of political defiance. For these original hearers, this meant God offered the peace, security, and welfare that supposedly was provided by the empire. This faith tradition acknowledges that God's grace and love allows people to wash their robes, not be dependent on the empire, the government, or anything else. And so we act in faith, but we don't act alone or in isolation. This great multitude of Revelation 7 reminds us of those who came before us in our faith. And so I go back to that original question: who formed you in your faith? Who influenced you? What action did they take to show you how to wash your robe in the sacrificial love of one who loves us more than we could ever ask or imagine? So my great-grandpa Galvin was born in the 1890s. And this week, as I was thinking about this message, I asked my dad, why didn't he get drafted into World War I? He had come from an Irish Catholic family in Kentucky, and as a young teenager, he and one of his older brothers, I think there were like 15 of them or something. It was a crazy number of him and his siblings. But he and one of his older brothers went to Detroit to make their way. And about the time of World War I, he was working for Packard. He went on to work for Ford for 40-some years. But my dad said he did get drafted. He received a draft notice from the Army, and it said, wait for further instructions. And he spent the rest of his life waiting for further instructions. Sometime before 1920, Grandpa Galvin met a nice young Methodist woman. And they got married during Nana Galvin's lunch break from the department store where she worked. She went back to work after the wedding. His family basically ostracized him for marrying a Protestant. And I don't think he really ever spoke to them again. But he joined her and became a United Methodist. In the 1960s, Nana and Grandpa Galvin visited a church in Royal Oak, Michigan. I don't know why. I don't know if someone invited them, but they went in and they experienced something new. Something for them that was profound. They felt like they encountered the Holy Spirit. And so they joined First Baptist Church of Royal Oak. And in their 60s, both were baptized again. Fast forward a few years, when my parents came back to Michigan after my dad had served in the Army in the early 1970s, they visited a few churches. My mother had grown up Methodist and my father Lutheran. And Nana and Grandpa, after a few months of not really settling somewhere, Nana and Grandpa invited them to come to First Baptist. I'm here today as a Baptist because of that invitation. I get the privilege of standing up and sharing with you a part of my story. But I want you to remember yours. I want you to remember those who formed you in your faith. Think about those individuals. Picture them now. And when you picture them standing in the great multitude before the throne of God. Amen.